Howdy everyone, and today I'm going to be testing out a new camera lens that's really quite astonishing and a lot of fun. It's the new Tamron 16 to 300mm f3.5 to 6.3 VC PZD. That's right, 16 to 300mm. No matter how good the reviews for this lens turn out to be, its incredible zoom range of over 18 times will make sure this lens sells well. Even though at over £500, it's definitely a little bit on the expensive side. This has the longest zoom range of any SLR zoom lens ever made, starting at a very wide angle of 16mm and zooming all the way into a super telephoto focal length of 300mm. It's easily the most ambitious APS-C super zoom lens ever made, especially with that handy wide angle of 16mm. It's quite a difference. Here's 18mm, the widest angle offered by most super zoom lenses, and now zooming out to 16mm. That extra space can be helpful. This lens is designed for less expensive digital SLR cameras with smaller APS-C sensors. It won't work on expensive full-frame cameras. So on my Canon 70D, 16 to 300mm is the equivalent of 25.6 to 480mm on a full-frame camera, which is pretty jaw-dropping. Super zoom lenses are basically all-in-one lenses of sorts. The advantage is that you can have just one lens in your kit bag rather than a few different ones you keep changing. However, the disadvantages of super zoom lenses can be considerable. They tend to have lower image quality than lenses with shorter zoom ranges. They are not normally as sharp, and they typically have more problems with distortion and chromatic aberration. Another big disadvantage is that they don't let in much light. This lens's slow maximum aperture of f3.5 at the wide end and f6.3 zoomed in makes indoor and low light photography a bit tricky. Also, that narrow maximum aperture means that you can't get a very blurry background. For example, here's a picture shot with the Tamron lens at 50mm, where the maximum aperture is f5, and here's the same picture shot with my 50mm f1.4 lens. As you can see, the fast prime lens gives you a beautifully out of focus background that the super zoom lens can't hope to emulate. Before we see if this lens can deliver on image quality though, let's look at its build quality. I like Tamron's new style of lens casing. This piece of kit looks very businesslike. It's not too big considering its huge zoom range, but you'll definitely feel its weight on your camera. The lens's zoom ring has a lock switch at 16mm and it's slightly heavy to turn with slightly uneven resistance, but actually it works very smoothly. I was able to get this reasonably nice slow zooming shot out of it. The lens has very good image stabilization, or vibration compensation, as Tamron call it. Here's some footage at 300mm with it turned off, and now turned on. Once it's properly kicked in, it holds your image reasonably steady. It's a tiny bit jittery as you pan the lens around, but it's smoother than previous Tamron lenses, so actually I think it's a comparatively good system. The image stabilization on this lens is so quiet that you can only just hear it if you put your ear against the lens. The lens has a focus ring that turns very smoothly and precisely, and it also has full-time manual focusing, so you can turn the ring anytime. This mechanism is a world away from Tamron's older super zoom lenses. The zoom and focus rings turn the opposite way from Canon's lenses, but the same as Nikon's, and the front element of the lens never turns during focusing, which is useful for people who like to use filters. The lens's piezo drive autofocus mechanism is reasonably fast and also reasonably quiet. However, as you can hear in this footage, it's a little bit noisy when it's micro-adjusting. The autofocus accuracy on my copy of the lens was fairly consistent, although it tended to focus hunt a bit in dark situations. Unusually for a super zoom lens, it has a gasket around the lens mount for extra weather sealing. The lens also comes with a lens hood that's smallish but still useful. Overall, I seriously like the build quality of this lens. The only sore points are that it's made of slightly low quality plastic and the lens wobbles a tiny bit. But aside from that, it's very well designed indeed and functions perfectly well in use. It's definitely the best handling super zoom lens I've ever used. Okay, so that's all good. Let's take a look at image quality. I'm testing it on my 20 megapixel Canon 70D. We'll start at its widest angle of 16mm. With the aperture wide open at f3.5, the picture is pretty sharp in the middle of the image, with pretty average colours and contrast. Over in the corners, the sharpness is just about holding out, but we're immediately introduced to some pretty noticeable pink and green chromatic aberration on contrasting edges, also known as colour fringing. You can even see it between the brickwork. Ouch. Stop the lens down to f5.6 and the image quality is a lot sharper, which is good, but unfortunately it also makes the chromatic aberration even more noticeable. There's no further improvement by stopping down to f8. So at 16mm, it's not a bad performance in terms of sharpness, but colour fringing is quickly making itself known. Let's zoom in a bit to 35mm, where the maximum aperture has already dropped to f4.5. The image quality is acceptably sharp in the middle of the picture, nothing special though. The corners of the image are very slightly softer, although happily, the pink and green chromatic aberration is greatly reduced. At f5.6, the corners are reasonably sharper and the middle of the image is looking good. There's no improvement when you stop the lens down to f8. So image quality is just about surviving at 35mm. Let's zoom in to 100mm. The maximum aperture is now f5.6. The centre of the image is very slightly soft with slightly poor contrast levels. However, the corners of the image aren't really any worse, although there are still strong hints of purple colour fringing. Stop the lens down for a little more sharpness and a lot of that purple fringing is reduced. The corners are pretty sharp at f11 with almost no chromatic aberration, which is fairly impressive. But the contrast levels are still slightly low, even back in the middle of the image. So it's a good performance at 100mm when the lens is topped down. Okay, let's zoom in to 200mm. The picture is reasonably sharp in the middle of the image at f6.3, the new maximum aperture. However, the corners look a bit soft, and they also present strong green and purple, you guessed it, chromatic aberration. Stop down to f8 and the corners are a bit sharper and they're acceptably sharp at f11, although the chromatic aberration is just as pronounced. However, the middle of the image looks great. So you can get some sharpness at 200mm, but that chromatic aberration really is on a counter-attack. What on earth will 300mm look like? Let's see. Zoomed all the way into 300mm and at f6.3, there is a little sharpness in the middle, but it's kind of buried by the lens's poor levels of contrast. As we slowly move into the corners, we can see the purple and green chromatic aberration running riot, and the image gets a little softer too. Stop the lens down to f8 for more brightness and a little more sharpness, especially in the middle of the image, which actually looks decently sharp now. There's no real improvement when you stop down to f11, even back in the corners. That really is some of the wildest chromatic aberration I've ever seen. It looks like there's been some kind of nuclear accident in the vicinity. Hope I can still have kids. Well, all that testing took a while. Overall, the lens gives us quite a rollercoaster ride of fluctuations in sharpness, contrast, and colour fringing levels. When used with the aperture wide open, you generally get an acceptably sharp image in the middle with somewhat soft corners. When you stop the lens down to f8 or f11, then generally you can get some pretty good sharpness out of this lens, but obviously the major issue is colour fringing. You're going to need some pretty good photo editing software if you want to exorcise this lens's chromatic aberration demons. Let's look at vignetting and distortion. Unsurprisingly, at 16mm, we see some pretty wild barrel distortion. It's what anyone would have expected to see on a lens with a record-breaking zoom range, but it's still pretty crazy. The good news is that vignetting, or darkness in the corners, is not too bad. Stop down to f5.6 and those corners get a tiny bit brighter. When we zoom in to 22mm, the distortion straightens out, and at 33mm it's flipped over into quite strong pincushion distortion, which stays around all the way to 300mm. Commendably though, the vignetting levels are still noticeable, but not too bad. All in all, a crazy performance for distortion, but above average for vignetting. This lens can get very close to your subjects indeed when you zoom into 300mm, so let's take a look at close-up image quality. At f6.3, the image is extremely soft due to severe ghosting and low contrast levels. This example picture is actually focused correctly. Stop the lens down to f8 for a massive improvement, and stopped down to f11, the picture is actually quite sharp. So if you're doing macro work, you'll want to stop the lens down to about f11. Let's see how well the lens works against bright lights. At wide angles, the Tamron is surprisingly resistant to lens flare, which is great news. Zoom in a bit though, and it struggles a little with its contrast levels. Because of this lens's narrow maximum aperture, it's not very easy to get out of focus backgrounds. When you do, the quality of this lens's bokeh is reasonably good, looking pretty smooth, if just a tiny bit smudgy. So then, finally, let's sum everything up. Despite having one or two slightly alarming problems with image quality, I ended up liking this Tamron lens quite a lot, mainly just for how well it's put together and its amazing zoom range. Even though the image quality is out of step with its build quality, I'm slightly ashamed to say that I did enjoy using it in all its craziness. I just won't be professionally shooting any weddings with it in the near future. Well, one of the lens's main competitors at the moment is the newest version of Sigma's 18 to 200mm super zoom lenses, the C for contemporary version, which I reviewed a short time ago. Here's a quick comparison. Obviously, the Tamron lens majorly wins out on zoom range. I do especially like that it can go wider than 18mm. The Tamron also has much better autofocus and image stabilization than the Sigma lens, which makes a really big difference. The Sigma lens is more compact though, which is what you'd expect. And it gives slightly sharper pictures too, and it has its chromatic aberration levels way more under control. The Sigma lens is also much less expensive than the Tamron. So, other super zoom lenses can give you better picture quality overall, that's for sure. But the Tamron really is so nice in just about every other way. As usual in the world of camera lenses, it swings and roundabouts. If you're really on the market for a super zoom lens, despite all their optical weaknesses, then good luck to you as you're making up your mind.